Welcome to our Israel-Palestine podcast, a project by graduating high school students from Berlin-Neukölln, home to Germany's largest Palestinian diaspora, and a second home to many young Israelis. Israel and Palestine are painfully present in our district and in our schools. We've spoken with historians, legal scholars, trauma researchers, and educators, some of whom are world-leading experts to better understand this ongoing conflict. Our approach has been multi-perspectival. We don't aim to resolve controversies or contradictions, but to hear different perspectives. Human rights and international law are the foundation of responsible multi-perspectivism. Can we learn to listen and hold conflicting truths at the same time? Find your own answers, or better, questions. Are you ready for the discomfort of learning?
Hello and welcome to this special episode of our Israel-Palestine podcast. I'm Yusuf.
And I'm Efe.
Today we're honored to speak with someone whose recent work has significantly deepened our understanding of one of the most formative and often overlooked episodes in modern Middle Eastern history, the Arab Revolt in Palestine from 1936 to 1939. We will also speak about the unfolding Holocaust and how the revolt and World War II changed British imperial policy and set the stage for the coming conflict. Our guest is Oren Kessler, a political analyst, historian, and journalist with a unique ability to combine scholarly rigor with accessible storytelling. His recent book, Palestine 1936, The Great Revolt and the Roots of the Middle East Conflict, has received both critical acclaim and widespread public recognition. The book was named one of the Wall Street Journal's 10 best books of 2023, listed among the Booklist Best Books of the Year, and was a finalist for both the National Jewish Book Awards and the Sophie Brody Medal. Most notably, Oren was awarded the prestigious 2024 Sami Rohr Prize for the Jewish literature. According to the Wall Street Journal, he's the first to tell this story from all three sides, British, Arab, and Jewish, and he was the first that used sources in all three languages, English, Hebrew, and Arabic. In addition to his accomplishments as an author, Oren Kessler has been elected a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, underscoring his contributions to the academic study of modern history. He holds a BA in History from the University of Toronto and an MA in Diplomacy and Conflict Studies from the Reichman University in Israel. Professionally, he has served as the Arab Affairs Correspondent for the Jerusalem Post, an editor and translator at Haaretz, and a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society in London. He was also Deputy Director for the research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington, D.C. His writing has appeared in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, The New Republic, and many others. He splits his time between Tel Aviv and New York, and today we're grateful to have him here with us. A very warm welcome, Mr. Kessler, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. It's great to be with you.
We start by diving right in. Before we dive into the revolt of 1936, could you help us understand the foundational developments? What were the key consequences of the Balfour Declaration of 1917, and how did Britain's mandate shape the course of Jewish and Arab politics in Palestine?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Balfour Declaration was issued by the British Empire on November 2nd, 1917, in the midst of the First World War, and it stated His Majesty's government's support for a Jewish national home in Palestine. It was a very short statement. There was a certain ambiguity in the wording. It wasn't totally clear what exactly was meant by the words national home. It wasn't totally clear what the borders of Palestine were in this formulation. But nonetheless, this statement was made in the eyes of the world, and the Allies went on to win the First World War, as we know. And then in the years after the armistice, after the war, the League of Nations was born, and it granted the mandate for Palestine to the British Empire. So basically, the League of Nations kind of handed guardianship, if you like, over Palestine to Britain, to the country that had made this Balfour Declaration. And even in the text of the mandate, the kind of constitution of the mandate, the League of Nations enshrined the Balfour Declaration right there at the beginning, and basically said that on behalf of the League of Nations, Britain will govern Palestine, and will facilitate the Jewish national home, will facilitate Jewish immigration and close settlement on the land. So that's really when the whole kind of Zionist experiment, the Zionist enterprise, really gets a major boost. The Zionist enterprise had begun earlier. The first waves of Jewish immigration, modern Jewish immigration, to Palestine had begun in the late 19th century. But really, the Balfour Declaration and the mandate gives it a huge boost. And of course, the Arabs of Palestine, basically the League of Nations takes 3 Ottoman provinces or pieces of 3 Ottoman provinces and says, okay, this is now British mandate Palestine. And the Arabs who lived in Jerusalem, in Jaffa, and Haifa, in this whole area from which I'm speaking to you now, of course, were uniformly opposed to the Balfour Declaration and to the Jewish national home policy. So it was seen as a real victory, of course, for the Zionist movement, and drew immediate condemnation from the Arabs of this land.
What was Herbert Samuel's role as the first High Commissioner, and how did his policies shape the ground realities in the 1920s?
So Herbert Samuel is a really fascinating, kind of forgotten character in the history of this conflict. He was a British statesman, but he was also Jewish. He was also very pro-Zionist, and he had been a minister in several British cabinets over the years in the early part of the 20th century. And he was chosen to be the first High Commissioner for Palestine. He was chosen by the British government to be first High Commissioner, which was really a demonstration of how committed they were to this Zionist policy, to choose this guy who is Jewish and is Zionist to be their first High Commissioner. But he was, despite that, he was very keen to be as fair as he could be, at least in his mind, towards both Jews and Arabs in this land. And he kind of came up with this idea of a dual obligation, namely that the British had an obligation to the Jewish national home on one hand, but also an obligation to protect the civil and religious rights of the non-Jewish inhabitants, namely the Arabs. So really, he was actually quite widely admired both by Jews and Arabs during the period of his commissionership, 1920 to 1925.
What happened during the mandate period in the 1920s and 1930s in terms of the early stages of Zionist proto-state and institution building?
Yeah, so really this was a period of tremendous growth for the Zionist movement. The benefits of British administration really showed themselves, the benefits of kind of having international support for their movement in the form of the British Mandate and the Balfour Declaration. And so really the Zionist movement grows by leaps and bounds in the 20s and in the 30s. Palestine has really developed to a tremendous degree in terms of infrastructure and roads and public safety and draining swamps. But it's a combination of this new administration, this British administration, and its kind of more modern methods of infrastructure and public health, and also just the energy and the capital that's coming in from the Zionist movement really transforms this patch of earth during the 20s and 30s very, very, very rapidly. And even in 1929, when the world is suffering the Great Depression, this land still has a budget surplus, one of the few in the world. So really, it's a boom time.
On the Arab-Palestinian side, how did a collective national consciousness begin to emerge? What grievances were building during the first mandate period, and was the early lack of recognition of the Arab national rights a core driver of growing unrest?
Yeah, I would say it definitely was. This is the period in which you really see a Palestinian Arab national identity really come into full bloom. That's not to suggest there was nothing before, but I think it's safe to say that, of course, historians debate this, but I think if the Zionist movement had if the Balfour Declaration hasn't really been made, and if Palestine hadn't been cut off from the rest of kind of southern Syria, it's possible that this land would have been part of a greater Syria, for example, and that a specific Palestinian identity might not have developed so strongly. Really, the Palestinian Arab identity develops in response to Zionism in many ways, and above all in the 20s and in the 30s, and the kind of the rights that I mentioned earlier that Herbert Samuel and the British promised to protect on the Arab side were individual rights, right? So civil rights, religious rights, okay? These are individual rights, but they're not collective rights. There were no collective rights really granted to the Arabs of Palestine. Those were only granted to the Jewish national movement in this place. And so certainly I think it's absolutely fair and correct to say that the Palestinian Arabs feeling that they were being denied a collective identity and collective rights certainly contributed to the unrest that we saw in the 30s.
Jewish immigration accelerated during the 1930s, especially after the rise of Hitler. How did this affect the political and demographic landscape and Arab reactions?
Absolutely. It's the rise of Hitler in January 1933 and really the rise of anti-Semitic movements across so much of Europe, in Poland and Hungary and Romania in the same period in the mid-1930s. This has the effect of turbocharging Jewish immigration to mandate Palestine. And so in the first half of the 1930s, the Jewish population of this land doubles. Here in Tel Aviv, from where I'm speaking to you from, the population triples in that period. Land sales double. So really, it's a tremendous boom time demographically for the Jews of Mandate Palestine. And that just completely changes as you said, the political, the demographic landscape of this land. And the Arab population is certainly perceptive enough to recognize that these changes are happening at a very, very rapid pace, and that new Jewish settlements are springing up in the countryside, new kibbutzim. That the city of Tel Aviv is growing massively. That Jews are becoming a greater and greater proportion. I think they become a majority in Haifa in this period, for example. So it's a complete and it becomes very clear to the Arab population that if things continue this way, the Jews would be a majority before long. And so that's really the backdrop to the core of my book, which is the Arab Revolt. That's the demographic backdrop.
Speaking of the revolt, moving on to the revolt itself, what triggered the Arab uprising in 1936, and what were the major motives driving it?
Yeah, so it's those demographic transformations that demographic transformation that we were just discussing is a major factor. So both in terms of demographics, the number of people, but also in terms of land sales, there was there was a phenomenon at the time in which certain wealthy Arab landowners would sell the land at inflated prices to the Zionist groups, even as they railed against the practice in public. Very many of these landowners were guilty in the Arab conception of selling land to Jews. Not everybody. The Mufti, I never found any evidence that the Mufti sold land, for example, but many of his confidants and colleagues, for example, did. And so that very often meant that the Palestinian Arab farmers who were working the land suddenly were unemployed or may even have lost their farms. And so this was certainly a major contributor as well. So both the demographic and the kind of geographic settlement transformation that we see in this period. And also just lastly, the fact that in this period, the Arabs of Palestine can see that their Arab brothers in other countries in this region are moving towards independence. So in Iraq, in Egypt, in Syria, in all of these places, they're not independent yet, but they're moving. They're striking deals, they're striking accords with the British and with the French to move towards greater autonomy, greater self-determination. Ultimately, they hope independence. And it's only here in Palestine that the Arabs feel that their national ambitions are not moving at all, and that they're under serious threat by this growing Zionist movement.
Can you outline the main events and the dynamics the revolt took, and how it was perceived by the British and the Yishuv, the near and all-Jewish community in Palestine?
Yeah, really, it's the kind of the opening shots of the revolt are fired by followers of a man named Sheikh Izzeddin al-Qassam, who those of you who follow the news closely will know, of course, that Hamas's armed wing is named after Qassam even today. But he was a preacher, a militant preacher in Haifa, who basically encouraged his followers to take up arms against the Jews and against the British as well. And so these followers kill 2 Jewish civilians near Nablus in what we now call the West Bank on April 15th, 1936. And these are really, and then a few days later, there are riots in Jaffa that are quite bloody. And these are really the opening shots in many ways of the Arab revolt. And at first it was seen by the British and the Yishuv, the kind of Jewish community here, that these were just riots. There had been riots before, there had been violence before. But as they continued, as they wore on, it became clear to everyone, British, Arab, and Jewish, that this was something new, that this was a sustained revolt. This was, as we might say today, an intifada, an uprising. And it ended up lasting 3 years. There had never been anything like it here before.
How did the Palestinian Arabs perceive the British at this point, and what did they hope to achieve through revolt?
Well, what they hoped to achieve, really, and this was articulated by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit, who was the unquestioned leader of the Arabs and the Muslims of Palestine in this period. He basically he made 3 demands and said that there was also a boycott, an economic strike that went along with these acts of violence, and he basically said that this strike would continue unless 3 demands were met, namely a complete ban on Jewish immigration, a complete ban on land sales, because again, he felt that left to their own devices, certain wealthy Arab landowners would continue to sell the land as if it weren't prohibited. And then the third one was more representative government, to have a legislature in Palestine that would reflect the demographics of the country, which were still in this period about 2/3 Arab. And so those were really the goals. The goals were to stop the growth of Zionism, the growth of the Jewish national home in its tracks, to, at the very least, arrest its development, and to have Arab independence, either as an independent Palestine or perhaps as part of an Arab federation. Those were the objectives.
How organized was the revolt? Was there coherent leadership or shared purpose guiding it, or was it more fragmented?
Well, I think in many ways the Mufti Hajj Amin was kind of I think most historians agree, and I from my research also tend to agree, that he was guiding the revolt along its main path. That doesn't mean he was sending every gunman to commit acts of violence, but he was sort of dictating its main direction for this revolt, whether in terms of kind of acquiring arms or money or just issuing guidance. The Mufti was really at the head of it in many ways, both in Palestine and then from late 1937 in Lebanon, because he ends up fleeing the country and going to Lebanon. But even from Lebanon, he's able to kind of pull the strings of the revolt. But on the ground, it was much more diffuse. And you had different militant leaders kind of doing their own thing and operating in different parts of the country, sometimes coordinating, but really not particularly closely.
What importance does the revolt hold in Arab collective memory, and is it present in Israeli collective memory, and how much attention has it received from Israeli historians?
It's a very good question. I think I write in the book that in Palestinian collective memory, it's been kind of sidelined. I think the Nakba has such a central place in Palestinian self-understanding that it kind of drowns out everything else. And the revolt is remembered in fragments in Palestinian national memory. There are certain folk songs that are remembered, certain figures that are remembered, but the revolt began with tremendous unity, but ended up really with an outburst of kind of Arab infighting, and you'd see kind of rival families and rival leaders settling kind of old scores under the cover of this revolt. And so I think it's that kind of complicates remembrance of this revolt in Palestinian collective memory, if that makes sense. And in terms of Israeli collective memory, I think really for both peoples, it's kind of a gap. It's kind of overlooked. I think in the Israeli collective memory, I write in the book that that the Israeli kind of story is one of building and of self-determination. This is the narrative that Israelis like to tell themselves above all. And I think the notion of a concerted nationalist uprising by another people against that kind of forward-moving narrative is kind of problematic in terms of narrative, if that makes sense. So both peoples have a sort of incentive to kind of forget about this revolt.
You already mentioned his name. Haj Amin al-Husseini is a central figure in this period. He was chosen by the aforementioned Herbert Samuel. What motivated this choice? How did he rise to power, and what role did he play in the revolts?
Yeah, absolutely. He was. It's one of the ironies of history that certainly the history of this land that Herbert Samuel, this British Zionist High Commissioner, chose this young Jerusalem Arab aristocrat by the name of Amin al-Husseini, who was about 25 at the time, to be the Grand Mufti and the head of the Supreme Muslim Council. Because really the Mufti, Haj Amin, went on to be a bitter opponent of certainly of Zionism and the Jewish national home, but also of the British Empire. And so really, I think it was probably, from a British perspective, it was a massive mistake. It was a massive error of judgment. I think Samuel was, for whatever reason, became convinced that Amin was a moderate. But very quickly, it turned out to be the case that he was quite intransigent in his political objectives. And so, yeah, I think what motivated Samuel in this case was really the fact that it was family politics. There was a feeling that the Husseinis had been deprived of various political posts. For example, the Jerusalem mayorship had gone to a rival family, the Nashashidis. So the British were trying to kind of make sure that the big families, the powerful families, were satisfied. They were basically trying to appease, in their view, the powerful Arab families. And so the idea was that the post needed to go to Husseini, and the Husseinis rallied behind this young man for various reasons. But I think in general, it's probably the one biggest mistake from a British perspective that Samuel made in his term.
How was he regarded within the larger Palestinian Arab community?
I think he was, it's complicated. I think he was widely admired to an extent because he was seen as resisting the Jewish national home and the British Empire. On the other hand, I think there were a lot of family dynamics. There was a lot of intra-Arab infighting and hostility. There was a whole. Basically, Arab society in Palestine was divided into two camps. There were the pro-Husseinis, who were known as the Majlisiyun, like the those around the Supreme Muslim Council, and then you had the opposition. The opposition was led by a family called the Nashashibis, and really, in that sense, a large chunk of Palestinian Arab society was actually against the Mufti, but they also had a certain sympathy for him, I think, when it came to resisting the British and the Jews. It got much messier when Arabs started fighting Arabs. That could get quite bloody, and I think it was widely known across Arab society that, in fact, the Mufti was behind a lot of that infighting.
What role did he eventually play during World War II? Did he remain influential after the war?
Yeah. So as I'm sure you know, and most people, if they know anything about the Mufti, they know that he spent World War II, most of World War II in Berlin, in basically under the protection of the Nazi regime. He famously met with Hitler, but once. He met with Heinrich Himmler at least, I believe, 3 times. And he was a vocal Nazi supporter. He was basically their lead figure on Arabic radio. The Nazis had Arabic radio that broadcast out of Italy, and he was their main voice. He was active in recruiting Muslim soldiers in the Balkans to the Axis, to really to the Axis army. And so he was quite disgraced, at least in Allied eyes, during the war. And if things had worked out a little differently, he might have been tried as a war criminal. It was later, in much more recent history, the Mufti came back into the news because Benjamin Netanyahu basically said that the Mufti gave Hitler the idea of the final solution, which I don't think there's any historical evidence of that. But nonetheless, it's almost certain that the Mufti knew about the Holocaust and was not particularly bothered by it. I think we can say that pretty safely. And then after the war in 1946, he was in custody in France, in Allied custody in France, and he fled and ended up or made his way to Cairo and continued really to lead the Palestinian national movement, despite having really become seen as disgraced in the eyes of much of the world. He, certainly the Allies, he went back and took his place at the head of the Palestinian national movement and was welcomed as such by the Arab League, by the King of Egypt, Farouk, and so I think it's one of those what if questions. How history may have worked out differently had he not fled capture in France, or had he not been welcomed back by the Arab states to lead the Palestinian Arab national movement. I think our imaginations can run wild, but he was really the leader of the Palestinians until the 48 war, until the Nakba, the defeat and dispersal of so much of Arab Palestine. And it was only then that really he became disgraced in the eyes of Palestinians and Arabs more broadly. It wasn't the collaboration with Hitler. That didn't have the effect of disgracing him, but the the defeat, the humiliation, the loss in 1948 really was the end of his leadership career.
How did the British respond to the revolt militarily, politically, and diplomatically?
So the British responded militarily in a very heavy-handed way. Some might even say in a brutal way. Certainly, many Arabs at the time considered it a very brutal response. Not only Arabs, there were British critics of the way the British were handling the counterinsurgency here. Really, you see in this period, especially starting late 1937, 1938, once Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, flies to Munich and kind of appeases Hitler, and the Munich crisis comes and goes. Really, the British are finally able to send large numbers of troops here to Palestine, and that's what they do. And they engage in a very, very heavy-handed military operation, and thousands of homes are destroyed in this period. This is when you see home demolitions begin on a really major scale. At least 100 Arabs are hanged in this period. Many thousands are killed in army operations. Huge numbers of weapons are confiscated. This is a period in which you see a lot of the most controversial methods employed by the IDF today actually have their roots in this period and in emergency regulations that the British passed in this period of the 1930s. So administrative detention, which is still used today by the IDF, namely detaining suspects without any specific causes based on kind of emergency regulations. This all has its roots in this period. And so that's on the military side. And then on the political side, I assume that we'll get to this a bit later, but the British ultimately passed the White Paper of 1939, which significantly rolls back their commitments to Zionism. But we can get to that a bit later.
In 1937, the Peel Commission proposed partition, the first such suggestion. How did the Arab and Jewish sides respond, and what does the Commission reports tell us about how Britain understood the conflict at that point?
Another very good question, and it reminds me that I should have mentioned the Peel Commission in answer to your last question, because really the Arab community in Palestine announces this economic strike, this boycott that I mentioned earlier. It's a 6-month general strike where they have no contact with the Jewish economy or with the British authorities. And that really bears fruit because it prompts the British to send this royal commission acting in the name of the king and it sends them over here to kind of examine grievances, primarily Arab grievances against British policy. And they spend several months here, and they write a report that clocks in at 400 pages, which I had the good fortune to read all of. But it's actually a very good report. It's actually quite well written and quite engaging, but it's remembered by history for its last really 10 to 15 pages, in which the commissioners recommend partition. They recommend dividing this land into a Jewish and an Arab state for the first time. This is really the first kind of two-state solution, if you like. So it would have been a Jewish state along the coast, and including Galilee, and then most of the rest of the land would be an Arab state, and then there'd be a smaller continued mandate around Jerusalem and Bethlehem. So basically, again, this is the first two-state solution that's put on the table, and in the history of this conflict, and it really becomes kind of the template for every subsequent attempt to partition this land. And there's a raucous debate among the Jews over whether to accept this plan, but ultimately the Jewish leadership decides to accept the principle of partition, at least at least in principle, with certain reservations. But the Palestinian, the Arab leadership under the Mufti, as you can imagine, rejects the plan out of hand as a humiliation, a degradation, an amputation, and they just completely reject it. And so, and so that's really where things stand in 1937, and then the British have to kind of decide what to do with the fact that that one side has accepted the plan with reservations, but the other side has rejected it completely.
You have studied the archive of the peer hearings. What do they reveal about the views the British held of Arabs and Jews at the time?
Yeah, it's really very, very interesting. It's very revealing. I think I read in the book that on the whole, my sense is that the British tended to have more affection for the Arabs, but more admiration for the Jews. And so, I think the British tended to look at the Arabs here in Mandate Palestine as just sort of natives, the way they would look at natives, quote unquote, in Africa or in anywhere else in the empire. And they had certain prejudices, assumptions about what it meant to be native versus British. But with the Jews, it caused quite a bit more kind of cognitive dissonance. They didn't know quite what to make of the Jews because most of the Jews living here had roots in Europe. They were quite European in culture, and they challenged British notions of what's a native, what's a colonist. It wasn't quite. They weren't British, but the British didn't see them exactly as native. They saw them as kind of European, but kind of not. So I think that's kind of the paradox: greater affection for the Arabs, but a kind of grudging admiration for what the Jews were able to accomplish here in terms of kind of nation building.
The later Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, an ardent supporter of Zionism, wrote a famous, or for some infamous, letter to the Peel Commission. In it, he said, quote, "I do not admit that the dog in the manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or to the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to those people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher great race, or at any rate a more worldly wise race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place." Do these views align with the attitudes you found in the Peel hearings, and how did they shape political relations?
Yeah, that's certainly one of the how should we put it? Juicier quotes in the Peel commissions, or you could say more offensive, depending on your perspective. Highly quotable, but yes, certainly probably offensive to the Arabs of this land. So I think you do encounter views like that in the Peel Commission hearings, particularly the private hearings, the secret hearings. I think Churchill took it a step further. I think Churchill was particularly committed to some very old-fashioned traditional ideas of empire and of native peoples and what they're capable of or not capable of. And this quote was made in the secret sessions, and basically Churchill and the other witnesses in the secret sessions were told that their words were that their words would never be public, that they would be destroyed. And so they speak very, very candidly because they were all under the impression that no one would ever see these comments. And somehow a few copies of the report survived, and that's why we know that he said this. There's a clear kind of paternalism there. There's a clear kind of patronizing attitude. towards Arabs and American Indians and Australian Aborigines. That's pretty. There's no two ways to look at it. And I think that probably did shape Churchill's views of the Palestine problem, Palestine policy, and contributed to him being against, for example, the White Paper of 1939 and against rolling back commitments to Zionism.
When does the wider global Muslim community begin to take interest in the issue of Palestine, especially within the British Empire, and what impact did that have on British policy?
So I think really that the 1930s are a key decade in terms of Palestine becoming a central concern for the Muslim world, for the global Muslim community. And that's due in large part to the efforts of Hajj Amin. Hajj Amin really works day and night to make Palestine, and more specifically Jerusalem, and even more specifically Al-Aqsa, a central node of Muslim identity, Muslim concern. He really promotes the idea that Al-Aqsa is in danger, that the Jews are planning to build a third temple on top of Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock. And he has something called the Jerusalem campaign, and there's even a conference that's held in Jerusalem in 1931 where he invites dignitaries from around the Arab and Muslim worlds to try to make them take a greater interest in Palestine and in Jerusalem. And then in the Peel Commission, you see the fruits of that, because the British start inviting, or even later in the St. James Commission, St. James Conference of 1939, the British for the first time invite neighboring Arab states to the negotiating table to determine the fate of Palestine. So really, from 1931 to 1939, you see a process of what some historians call regionalization, where this goes from being a conflict between two local communities towards being a really regional and even international conflict that involves the Jewish world, the Muslim world, the Western world. So it's really a key decade in that.
You already mentioned the white paper from 1939. What was it about, and what drove this decision?
Yeah, the white paper of 1939 was passed in spring, summer 1939. So of course, we know in hindsight, it's a crucial time. It's just a few months before the start of the Second World War. And of course, shortly before what we now know would be the Holocaust. And so really the white paper is the main achievement from an Arab perspective of the revolt, because the white paper, basically, it's 1939. The British see that world war is looming. It's a matter of when and not if the world would be back at war, and they just determined that Palestine is not worth it anymore. It's causing too much headache, too much blood and treasure, and they decide to significantly roll back their commitments under the Balfour Declaration. And so they call a conference in London, and they invite the Jews and the Palestinian Arabs, and as I mentioned, the Arab states. And the result of this conference is really is this white paper, which significantly cuts Jewish immigration to Palestine. From, for example, in 1935, 60,000 Jews came to this land legally, and perhaps more illegally. And according to this white paper, over the next 5 years, 75,000 Jews could arrive total, not per year, after which any further immigration would have to depend on Arab consent. And of course, it was very clear that consent was not going to happen. And so really it was, this was in line with what the British called appeasement, You can see it in the cabinet meetings. They talk about, quote, appeasing Arab opinion, just like they were trying to appease Mussolini's Italy and Nazi Germany. This was part of a strategic effort to try to kind of pacify Arab opinion and Muslim opinion. And it was very clear to the British that the Jews were not going to support Hitler. So the Jews were going to be on board with the Allied war effort anyway. And so it was, those were really the motivations behind this change in policy, that just supporting Zionism so fully just didn't seem to be worth it anymore.
What was the goal of the 1938 Evian Conference, and how did its failure reflect global attitudes toward Jewish refugees? What role did Palestine play, and how directly did British policies, especially after 1939, affect Jewish escape routes and the fate of Holocaust victims?
So the Evian conference was held in France on Lake Geneva in summer of 1938, and it was really a conference that was instigated by President Roosevelt in Washington, and it was an attempt to find, or at least give the impression of looking for a solution for political refugees. The word Jewish was not uttered, but it was quite clear to everyone that that's who they were talking about. And really, the conference was really kind of went down in history for the fact that very, very few countries were willing to accept any of these refugees from particularly from Germany, any of these Jewish refugees from Germany or Austria. And really, there was other than the Dominican Republic, and I think maybe that was it, that was willing to accept a few thousand refugees. Almost every country said that they weren't willing to do so. And so, and Palestine was really barely mentioned in this conference at all. And so, yeah, it's really remembered as a kind of missed opportunity, and one that perhaps could have taken some of the pressure off of both the persecuted Jews of Germany and of Europe, but also potentially some of the pressure off of Palestine, because it really left, when the Evian Conference failed, it really left Palestine as the only sanctuary left for these persecuted Jews in Germany and elsewhere in Europe. And again, we can let our imaginations run wild about what may have happened. Maybe a few thousand or more people's lives could have been saved from Hitler had the Evian Conference gone differently. But we'll never know, I suppose.
Did international organizations like the Red Cross or the League of Nations have an appropriate grasp of a response to the horrors of the Holocaust?
Well, I think it's a question that's beyond my immediate area of expertise, but I've certainly read some quite damning reports of the Red Cross in this period, that they didn't do enough, that they were aware of more than they let on in terms of the crimes that were being committed. But that's it's probably more of a question for a scholar of the Holocaust, which I am not.
You argue that the 1936 to 39 revolt shaped the trajectory of the modern conflict. In what specific ways? Are today's political realities still shadowed by these events?
Yeah, absolutely. I think really, I think, as I mentioned earlier, the revolt was in many ways the crucible for Palestinian identity. In many ways, it was a period in which Palestinians, Arabs in Palestine, united in a common cause against a common foe, namely Zionism and its British imperial facilitators. And it united rival families, rich and poor, within the Arab community, urban and rural, even Muslim and Christian to a large extent, in this common effort, and at least on the face of it, behind a single leader, namely the Mufti. And so, in those ways, I think we still very much feel the effects of it today. On the Jewish side, this is really the period in which you see the seeds of a Jewish army being sown for the first time. And it's all through British facilitation. This is completely forgotten both in Israel and outside of Israel. It was in this period when the British initially found themselves unable to really quash this revolt that they agreed to Jewish requests and pleas to arm and train the Jews in large numbers, to integrate Jews in the British security apparatus. So you see thousands of Jews, mostly men, enlisted in the Palestine police, some of them even in the British Army. And they're getting their weapons and their salaries from the British, but ultimately they're loyal to and answerable to the Haganah, to the main Jewish armed force in this period. And then just lastly, this is the period in which you see the birth of the two-state solution that we mentioned earlier. So in all of those ways, I think the revolt is still with us in many ways.
Last but not least, as a closure of our podcast, we always ask a little personal question of sorts. And I'd like to ask you, what was the most surprising thing you discovered in your research for this book? And was there an archival moment or a forgotten voice that stayed with you?
Well, I think there's one character that I tried to kind of rescue from obscurity in my book. It's a guy named Musa Alami, who I think readers have really responded very well to. And he's a guy who was Cambridge educated, a very brilliant guy from an important Jerusalem Arab family, who was an Arab patriot, a Palestinian patriot in every way. He was an Arab nationalist, but he also had a lot of friends and colleagues across the aisle among the British and even among the Jews. And for example, he would meet regularly with David Ben-Gurion, who would go on to be the first prime minister of Israel years later. And they, despite having extremely different political ambitions, they would meet in an atmosphere of real respect and even warmth. And I thought it was just he was a very compelling character in that way, respected by all three sides, and I think in terms of kind of surprising characters, a surprising personality, I think he would be the man I would point to. I was very happy to be able to give him a platform, because I think he's just a really fascinating person.
This marks the end of our podcast. Thank you so much, Oren Kessler, for taking your time, sharing your insights with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Those were really very, very good questions. Oh, sorry if I cut you off. That was very rude.
No problem. It's all right.
Thank you guys so much. This was really enjoyable. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. If this conversation was meaningful or unsettling, if it left you with answers or more questions, feel free to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time on our Israel-Palestine podcast.